So my name is Luke DeCoste. I have a background in engineering and then started working in governments and was very curious about the question, where are the numbers? The numbers I was so used to in engineering weren't present in governments. And so I got very curious about that and spent a lot of time working in different Indigenous governments, largely in the Yukon, some in NWT and BC, and did a number of projects that help me understand better what it is to make change inside these governments. That may have involved changing some of the processes around data collection, but it also involved a number of projects related to helping to roll out technology within governments. Some of those projects went well, and some of those I learned some lessons that hopefully I can share with you today. And I am joined today by Katie, and I'll let her share a bit of her experience with change.
For sure. So my name is Katie Newcomb. I'm an associate with Davis Peer. I am one of the change managers in our firm, and I became interested in change management actually deriving from project management. I was working on a lot of different projects, and we were coming across some issues with getting things moving forward, and we were realizing it's because people aren't buying into what we're doing. So I started researching more about why that is, and I became very interested in change management. So now it's something that I annoyingly push on all of the projects that we do. Sometimes clients are really interested, sometimes they're not, but eventually they always buy in because they understand change management is really just about supporting your people. And I'm not going to talk anymore about that because we're about to talk to you a lot about it.
Yeah, so some of you may have worked with me on a project I did with a previous organization, the socioeconomic scan, the environmental scan. And I now work with an organization named Davis Peer with Katie, and we're a team of about 45 people or so. And we have a really interesting mix of engineers, industrial engineers, and policy people, but also behavioral science people who help with this behavior change. And so we'll go in and we'll do an organizational, like a government department. We'll be looking to change the way it delivers programs or looking to deliver technology. And we have people who are very oriented around data or technology, but we'll bring someone in like Katie who will help create the conditions for the change to take place. So today's presentation, we're going to be talking about change management concepts and introducing some change management tools that will be part of the toolkit. And we're going to elaborate on those using the fictitious Sulingituk government that you've probably seen in some of the other webinar presentations. And we hope that you'll ask questions both throughout and at the end, there'll also be some time as we go. So if you haven't learned about the Sulingituk government, it was created to allow us to have different conversations as part of the data governance and management toolkit. It's intended to be sort of representative of the types of governments that are on this call. It has 700 members or 700 citizens. There are many competing priorities. I'm sure that's something you're all familiar with. It's headed by an elected governing body with an executive director, and there are 8 departments and 80 staff. Now, this isn't exactly the same, I'm sure, as your particular government, but hopefully it allows us to illustrate what's needed when doing change management.
So we're going to start off with what is change management. And I think in probably the simplest way, it's basically just all the processes and approaches that you can take to prepare and support people in making change. So it isn't something that should be one size fits all. I know a lot of people hear change management and it's such a buzzword. And people think, oh, it needs to be this big thing, but it can be very adaptive depending on the type of change that you're facing and how the people who are impacted feel about the change. For example, if most of the people are really bought in and they've been along the journey to where you got to decide to make the change, you might not need as many resources or tools to help support it as if you're trying to get people caught up on your journey, or if you have some people who are hesitant or feeling anxious about the change. So basically, change management is about supporting everyone who is impacted through all the stages of change. So thinking about preparing for the change, actually implementing what the change is going to be, and then supporting them ongoing as they adapt to life after whatever that change looks like. Also, feel free to jump in with questions at any time. I'm happy to answer. So continuing on that thought about change management is about supporting everyone who's impacted. I recognize as I was writing it, I was like, this feels like a very overwhelming statement. So throughout this presentation, we're going to try to break that down a little bit to show some really simple, tangible ways that you can support people through change. So we identified 4 questions that can help support leaders to successfully manage change. So the first one is about how can we make sure people understand the change? The second one is how are people feeling about the change? The third is how do we support people through the change? And the last one is what tools can be used to support the change? So we're going to walk through each of these questions and apply them. I'll note that all of these are kind of assuming that it's been decided the change needs to happen no matter what. So we're looking specifically at like a data management tool has been decided, they're going to implement it. And now what do we do to support people to bring them along on the journey?
So one of the 4 pillars that we'll be talking about throughout is how can we make sure that people understand the change? And this can be unpacked in many ways. So you may think, oh, well, John is just going to be the data entry clerk, and John doesn't need to understand that this is coming until it's on his computer and we want him to use it. But that may have John sitting in his office knowing there's something happening, not sure what's coming down the pipeline. And that can contribute to him not sharing information back that's needed, him not being willing to support what's happening because he's just unsure. And he like many people in your governments, has a lot on his plate. So you want to engage in a 2-way communication. So you're keeping this individual up to date as you go along, and waiting to hear back from him as well. You know, asking questions, helping this individual understand the change that's coming, and it's important to use many tools and be pretty intentional about this communication. It's easy if you're in, one director's office or a member of the elected official to think, oh, everybody knows about this new tool that's coming out. But having a system where you are planning to send out emails at a certain time and sharing PowerPoints and taking many different approaches will help ensure that the information gets out. And finally, it's important that the information is supported at the top. You wouldn't want to leave someone that's kind of lower in the organization trying to support this change. People need to know that this is a priority from people at the top, whether that's, for example, an executive director or even elected officials. Because if the people who are going to use the tool aren't interested in it, they can very easily just not enter the data and continue to use paper forms, for example, and that will limit your ability to get the benefits of implementing this tool. So it may be not intuitive to think about, oh, why are we talking about feelings here? We're talking about change, but this is so important to effective change. If you're in a relationship, the difference between saying to someone, how is it going? And or can we do this? And they say, fine. Well, that's very different if they say like, fine, yeah, that'd be great. And I think it's important to really be present with people and understand how they may be feeling about it. It's quite reasonable for someone to think, I have a ton of responsibilities right now, and the idea of taking on another tool, that's overwhelming to me. Or I'm afraid that using this tool is going to result in our citizens' data being accessible on the internet. And it's important to really unpack these feelings, because sometimes they could be very legitimate. This person may know something about the vendor, for example, and really want you to hear that. So it's about really trying to understand their emotions and get them on side with what they may be resisting. And maybe sometimes you may have to change course. Yes, we've decided as a government that we're going to pursue this tool, but back to John. John is afraid that this is going to create a lot of work for his team. Well, let's listen to John, hear where he's coming from, and maybe we need to change our plan a little bit and provide John more resources. And it's, as part of this, it's also important just to share the grand vision. Why are we doing this? Why are we making John go through this work? And if John understands that this is to help us have better data, to better understand what's happening with our citizens and to improve the lives of our citizens, that staff member may be more willing to support this change, even though it's going to be extra work for them. So it can help, as we did here with the fictional government, the Sulingituk government, to kind of break down the different groups and to understand how they're feeling. And so you may break it down, for example, to community members, staff members, elected officials, and you may break it down further depending on different types. You can imagine if you're rolling something, a technology for data collection out, that community members may not be aware of the change. They're not really concerned about this. They're thinking about if the government's going to provide them with the services that they typically do, but they're expecting things to generally stay the same. As I was indicating with the example of John, staff may feel overwhelmed by the lack of resources to support their existing workloads. They think the data management system could be great, but it could be a lot of work and it may not work. And people may have been exposed to situations before with technology being proposed that was going to make everything better and it didn't. And so they may be a little bit resistant to taking on that technology. And then finally, the elected officials, they're making many important decisions on everything from resource projects to housing decisions to thinking about elections. Someone has brought it to their attention that a new data system is needed and they're willing to support it, but they may not have had the time to really unpack what that means, what the implications are. Go to the next slide, Katie.
It's frozen, sorry.
Oh,
there we go. So the next concept that we're looking at is how can we support people through the change? So I'm going to say this a bunch of times, like there's so many different ways you can support people through change and there's so many tools that can help you. And again, like it can be overwhelming to think of all the different change management tools that are available. But I find it's best to keep it very simple and straightforward and concise and clear in your communication. So not overwhelming people with a lot of information. I'm just giving them what they need to know and giving them some time to digest and ask questions about it. So based on our understanding of the Sulingituk government, we have identified 3 considerations when approaching the change. So one of the biggest ones is make sure you give attention to people who are most impacted by and concerned about the change. So we'll talk about doing a bit of an impact assessment, and you can identify those people who I think we mentioned the staff are probably going to be the most impacted by this change. So you want to really make sure that you're spending extra time with them and making sure that they're feeling very comfortable and their anxieties are addressed. It's also important to acknowledge that people experience change differently. And depending on how many other stressors they have going on in their lives or whatever else might be going on, past experiences with something similar, they might need extra hand-holding and they might need extra support to feel comfortable with the change. Another great tool to use are change champions. So they're individuals who are going to be key proponents of the change. I've worked with people who have sometimes chosen people who are the biggest opposers, and they take the time to really get them bought in and supportive of the change. And then they end up being their change champions, which can be really important in terms of getting people to buy in and see, well, if Johnny, who was very opposed to it now, is very interested, it speaks to the value of the change. And the last piece that we have is making sure that you have regular, clear communication that keeps people informed. A lot of anxiety about change comes from people feeling uncertain about what's happening or unsure about how they're going to be impacted or feeling like they're out of the loop. So making sure that they're kept informed of what's happening, what's coming next, what they can expect is really important in making sure people feel comfortable with upcoming changes. So our last question here is what tools should the change leader use to support the change? I'm not going to say it again because I've already said it. There's so many that you can choose from, but just looking at this specific scenario and just some pretty simple ones, I think that we use pretty consistently on projects that would be most helpful. We've identified 4. So the first one is a change impact assessment, a communication schedule, a question and answer document, and then a training plan. So we're going to walk through each of these in a little bit more detail and give some examples as well. So the first one is a change impact assessment. So the purpose of it is basically, it's an opportunity to look at everyone who could be impacted by the change, understand how they're impacted, and look at ways to meaningfully engage with them. So in terms of looking at the impact, it's going to involve some conversations, probably. You can make a bit of an assumption to start, but you're going to have to talk to them to see how is this really going to impact your day-to-day. And then it's kind of a values assessment to see how much they're impacted. So you can look at, this person is very impacted, they have a medium level of impact and a low level of impact, and that might change how you engage with them and how much you have to communicate with them about the change. In terms of when it should be used, it should be brought in as early as possible. So as soon as the potential for change is identified, you should start thinking about, okay, who is this going to impact? How are they impacted? And what can we do to make sure that they're feeling supported? And then lastly, what does this tool look like? We provided a little bit of an example here. So you'll have the stakeholder group, you'll look at how they are impacted, you look at how much they're impacted, which is a bit of a values decision. And then you look at how you can meaningfully engage with this stakeholder group. So we did a little bit of a sample that is completely made up, so just keep that in mind. But in terms, like looking at community members, we mentioned earlier, there really is no direct impact. However, if the staff are feeling overwhelmed, community members might notice the impact to other services that government provides. Another one, if they're having to input information in a new way, you might have to do some engagement with them just to make sure that they're understanding how to do it properly if there's any changes there. So we assess this as a relatively low level of impact, and based on that, you can decide different ways to engage with them. So it might be a little bit lighter engagement that maybe is a little bit more one-way focused. So looking at like posts through social media or having posters or different things just to let them know about the upcoming changes. So staff, we mentioned, would have a high level of impact. They're going to have to learn a new data management system and adjust their practices for managing data. So they're going to have a lot of education, and that's on top of all the workload that they have already. So we want to make sure we spend extra time with them, given the fact that there's a high level of impact. So we want to have regular, consistent two-way communication, look at different mediums to make sure that they're getting information in different ways to make sure that they're really understanding it. And really just spending some extra time with them, given that they are going to be the most impacted. And then lastly, we have our elected officials. So our interpretation is that they might benefit from easier access to information, but they're still going to have a medium level of impact because they're going to be receiving questions from people about what does this change mean? They're going to have to be very well versed on what's happening. So we're going to have to keep them informed of the change through some quick, simple communications, some one-liners that they can share just to keep people informed. Another tool that we looked at is a communication schedule, which I love. It's a very easy way to keep things organized. It lets you think through how you're going to communicate with people, how you can make sure it's consistent, how you can make sure you're regularly checking in. It's another one that should be brought in as early as possible. So after you finish your impact assessment and you have an understanding of, okay, these are the people who need to be communicated with regularly. These are ones we should check in with like every couple of weeks or so. And you can kind of build a communications plan around that. So there's a few different ways to visualize it. I usually use 2 different options, which we're going to walk through here. So you notice the numbers are random because we just pulled a couple of samples in terms of different mechanisms and different ways that you can communicate with people. So usually with a communication schedule, we start with identifying who the recipient's going to be. And then we look at who's going to be responsible for sending this. Another one that we often will include is who's responsible for drafting. So if it's an email or a PowerPoint presentation or something like that, you want to make sure someone's on the hook for actually pulling that information together. Another important piece to capture is what is the purpose of this communication? So what are you trying to get across to this group of recipients, and what do they need to know? What's going to be valuable to them? Then you look at the mechanism. So how are you going to do this? It could be a mix of things. It could be a social media blast. It could be an in-person meeting. It could be an email. It could be a letter. Like, there's so many different ways that you can communicate with people. You'll want to have a specific date for when it's happening. And then you kind of want to keep track of where is this. So maybe we still need to develop the materials. Maybe it's been sent. So it's basically just a tracking tool to keep track of all the communications that you have, that you've completed, and what's upcoming as well.
I'll just jump in for a sec, Katie. I mean, this may at first glance look like, oh, this seems like a lot of process to do, but it's something that may only take 20 minutes, and it can make such a world of difference. I've actually learned quite a bit going through this process with Katie. I would have done these things kind of informally, not really knowing the right way to do it. And when Katie was teaching me a bit about some of these best practices, I thought, wow, this would really have helped us. Nothing is worse than accidentally missing someone when you are going to communicate the change, and they start to think that they're being kept out of it for some reason, and they can start to make conclusions that aren't fair. Or another one is just labeling who's going to actually be responsible for communicating that. That way someone doesn't say, oh, I thought Mary was doing it, or I thought John was doing it. This way it actually gets done.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I find a lot of times when you're in like this project implementation environment, you're so focused on getting the next thing done, and you maybe think that you're communicating more than you are. So having it actually written down and seen visually, okay, we haven't talked to them since 4 weeks ago. We really should do a check-in and just let them know how things are going. Even if there really isn't an update, that's still an update. You can let them know we're kind of status quo right now. A lot of people think they only need to reach out and do a communication when there's actually something to update on. But in the absence of communication, a lot of times a lot of assumptions are happening, and people are, I know some clients that I've worked with, they haven't communicated to their staff for a little bit, and then all of a sudden we're hearing all of these rumors because people haven't been hearing what's going on. So communication is very important. So another way to look at a schedule is actually putting it out on a calendar, which is something I like to do. It lets you see kind of at a higher level, okay, these are all the things that we have to do this month. So a lot of times at the beginning of the month, we'll take our this schedule and turn it into a bit of a calendar view, so we can see, okay, these are all the things we have going on, and you can kind of identify, oh, this week we're not communicating with anyone. We should really probably pop something in there just to make sure people are aware of what's going on. And this is something that can actually be sent out to your high impacted stakeholder groups. So your staff could receive this calendar view and say, okay, we can expect to get an email update on Friday the 26th. It's also a way to hold you accountable, which can be a good and bad thing, I would say. So another valuable tool that I'm seeing used increasingly with clients is a question and answer document. So this is something that it's literally just a question written out and then an answer to that question, which sounds very simple, but it's really important because it's letting people get the same information. So everyone who's receiving it sees the same question, they see the same information, they can refer back to it, they can follow up and ask additional questions from the sender. It's just a really good way to make sure that things are being shared consistently. One note on this is that you'll have to have an understanding of what staff are wondering about in order to have a valuable question and answer document. You shouldn't just be assuming, okay, these are things they might have questions about. It's really good to actually engage with staff and see where their concerns are and what they'd like to learn more about. So it should be used once people have a bit of an initial understanding of the change and they've had a little bit of time to digest it. It should be updated regularly and shared with staff as new questions are identified. That being said, if there's something that's very concerning, it should be addressed right away. You should never wait because we said, oh, we're going to send out a change on Friday the 26th and it's the 12th. You should always just deal with things as they come up. So what this looks like, there's a sample question, and then this is a little bit long here, I guess, but there's a relatively concise answer written out that people can read and absorb and understand, and it just makes sure everyone's getting the same information. There should always be a contact person in case people have follow-up questions. It's usually sent out by email to everyone at the same time, so they're all getting the same information on the same day. And then our last tool, which I don't have an example here because it can be a pretty bulky document, but it's a training plan, which we thought was especially relevant here, where people are going to have to learn a new technology system. A lot of uncertainty and hesitation towards change can come from people not feeling confident in their ability to support that change. So if someone who has become very comfortable with printing out documents and putting them in a file is suddenly told, oh, you're going to have to use an online data management system, they may be very hesitant about the change, and they may push back quite a bit because they're not feeling comfortable. So having a training plan to address this concern that's clearly communicated is a great way to show that you hear staff's concerns and that you have a plan for how to support them through the change. So a training plan usually includes items like it has the purpose of training, what we're trying to get out of it, when it's going to happen, who's going to receive the training, the objectives and goals of it, some different training materials and development plans, and how the learners will be engaged. So it'll have, maybe there's different teaching methods, maybe you'll be using practical examples, making sure people have practice time to actually get into the system and try it out. So I've just talked through a lot of stuff. I can pause for questions if people would like. Oh, you're on mute, Luke.
Thanks. Yeah, we have a few questions coming in the chat, and we'll get to those. That was always helpful to see what you go through, Katie. One thing I'll just kind of, to try and wrap it up a bit, summarize. One of the most important takeaways for me is that change management is piece of the work. Often we think about, we need to procure the system, we need to design the system, we need to get budget approval, but we kind of forget that there's this body of work around change management, and just asking some of those early questions. How can we make sure people understand the change? How are people feeling about the change? How do we support people through the change? And then what tools can we use to support that change? Just taking, maybe setting up a meeting early on and thinking about that, and assigning someone to be a lead around change management. Just some of those early steps can really go a long way. We did cover a lot of content here, and this will be available through the toolkit, and we're also available later if there are questions, but happy to jump into questions that are coming up now. I see Harmony has her camera on. Harmony, would you like us to dive into the questions in the chat? Is that the?
Yeah, I think that would be good. Like there's one that, maybe I'll summarize them and then you guys can just kind of go for it. But there was one that I had asked, which was like, what happens if you're kind of in the middle of a project, you've done all of this planning work, and there's an election that happens in the middle and you have a significant turnover of elected leadership? Like what would be kind of the right strategy to manage that? I mean, that wouldn't be a surprise. That could be something you plan for, but what have you seen be effective in that context? And then Jen Jansen's asked a question about that. I think what she's getting at there is like the side of the desk thing, right? Like we ask people to do change off the side of their desk and sit in meetings and, you know, send emails and get trained, especially training, get trained in a whole new way of working without necessarily accounting for that in terms of their other responsibilities. So like, what does that impact look like? Obviously, it would depend on the project a bit, and just what should senior management be thinking in terms of how to provide for like the practical time allocation needed for staff to manage through the change?
Yeah, I'm happy to take the first one, and maybe Katie, if you can jump on the second one. So probably most of the people on this call have worked in governments and been through elections, and it's kind of similar to maybe a provincial government where the staff their job during that transition and during the election is to kind of sort of keep the lights on, not to make really significant decisions. You wouldn't want to make the decision to pursue this tool in the middle of an election, but you would want to make sure that pieces are moving along at a normal pace. And then when the new leadership gets in, taking the time to explain the project, where it's at, why it was pursued. And they, as elected officials, have the right to decide that they want to go a different direction. Now, hopefully they're able to understand the costs of changing direction in the middle of a project, and they want to continue forward. But I think it's about kind of just keeping the project going during the election, and as the government gets into power, and then they're going to be flooded with 1,000 different priorities on a big resource project and this housing issue and so many other things. And so the champion for the project may need to do some change management with them. How are you, what do you understand about the project? How are you feeling about the project? And thinking about how to support that leadership in understanding the value and why this was actually decided upon. And then, as public servants have to do, it's speak truth to power and implement loyally, and kind of follow the direction that they want to go.
Thanks, that was helpful. Katie, do you want to pick up on the side of the desk scenario?
Sure. I was hoping Luke would take this one because it's a challenging question that a lot of people really struggle with. We're actually working through something like that that's pretty similar right now. They're implementing a very large technology change at a department that I'm working with. And the staff are really struggling because they're having to do a lot of it off the side of their desk. And I think one of the best things that their manager said to them is that it's okay. Like, if you're not getting your day-to-day work done, we understand how much pressure we're putting on you right now. And just being very understanding of the situation that they've been put in. A lot of them didn't ask for this change. They're kind of just being told, okay, this needs to happen. You need to support it. I'm going to support you while you support it, but they're really being told what to do. So just being very accommodating and understanding, and letting them know that the pressure that you're feeling is temporary. And it's okay if you're not getting everything done that you need to do, and adjusting things as needed. So everyone always has timelines and deadlines that things need to be done. And sometimes it's not realistic given resource capacity. And there needs to be some understanding of that and some flexibility to make sure that staff aren't feeling burnt out, and that they aren't going to just hate the system forever because of this horrible experience that they had during implementation. So you really need to be accommodating to staff and make sure that they're feeling heard, and that their experience isn't tainted by a really horrible implementation process.
Yeah, to not leave Katie out alone on that one. It's a hard question, and there's no easy answer. I would point back to these tools. If you're worried that staff are kind of getting overwhelmed or finding it hard, maybe gather your change management team together for a meeting. Go back to the tools. Look at do people understand the project? How are they feeling? And maybe you need, to Katie's point, maybe you need to say, you know what, let's slow the implementation of this project. Let's push a few of those milestones back, and make accommodations to our plan, so we don't burn people out or create resistance. It's okay if this gets implemented 6 months later or 10 months later than we had hoped.
So just inviting folks again, if you have questions, you can feel free to pop them in the chat or use your hand up function. Otherwise, I always have a million questions and can monopolize a lot of time. So while I'm waiting for anybody else's question, like, would you say that, like, I've been participant in various, especially technology projects that are implemented and then nobody uses the system. And then later on, it's like, well, we invested all this money in the system and people are asking for a system when actually it's been implemented, but the change process really wasn't planned effectively and people just aren't using it, right? They still have their spreadsheets on their desktop or whatever. So would you say that, like, this type of process that you've described could also happen kind of after the fact?
Yeah, I think that's something that we notice gets missed a lot. I know for myself, a lot of times I'm brought in to support preparing for implementation and on the implementation day itself. And then we leave hoping that they'll continue all the change management processes that we've taught them. But change management doesn't end on the day of implementation. Like all this communication, all this support should continue after implementation until you see a really good uptake and people are really comfortable with and just naturally using the system. I think that's the biggest thing. I would say, like change management, I think we mentioned at the beginning, it's about preparing for, implementing, and then sustaining the change as well.
I think, Harmony, too, that there's and this is kind of outside of this particular session today, but some important questions around when you're deciding to purchase the system at the start, like were the right people involved, or was this just one department saying, I want this solution, it's going to help me? And then the structure of the arrangement with the vendor, is the vendor paid on the day that the system is turned on and then they go away, or is there a holdback that makes it so that their compensation is tied to uptake of the system? And so that's going to incentivize them to sit with the people that are implementing it, make sure they really understand the tool, make sure the tool works for them. So there's some stuff that can be done up front, but I think, yeah, it's a kind of an ongoing process, and having people that are assigned to make sure that this is taken up throughout is helpful.
Yeah, Mark's made a comment in the chat that keeping the kind of why of the change front and center throughout seems to be kind of the common thread that gets pulled through all of the tools that you presented. Do you have any comment on that? Additional comment?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Katie.
Oh, we're too polite. And the why might actually look different for different stakeholders. So why you're implementing it and how it's going to benefit your staff will be different than how it benefits your citizens versus how it benefits the elected officials. So making sure you really tailor that communication for the audience to make sure that it really resonates with them is important as well.
Mm-hmm.
I was part of a technology product where I was the vendor, and we were rolling it out for a government, and the deputy minister wanted this tool because it was going to allow them to better understand what was happening in their department. And so they said, let's do a pilot. We'll test out and see if it works. But the staff didn't like using it. And so they just didn't enter any data. And then after 3 months, there was no data for the deputy minister to benefit from. And they said, thanks for the pilot, but we're not going to proceed. And so we had to go back and change the product to make it easier to use for the staff, and actually put some features in that benefited those staff, so that, it helped them to track this data. And so a subsequent pilot was actually successful because the tool had been adjusted to accommodate both those, kind of making a why both for the frontline staff as well as the senior officials.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That was very familiar to me, that example.
Yeah.
I've been in that situation. I see Jen Jensen has her hand up. If we can allow her to speak and put her video on.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, perfect. Okay, hang on a sec. Okay. Yeah, so just to echo what Luke has said, having worked with TFN on trying to implement SharePoint as a document management system across the organization for the past few years, and it is a slow process, and it's really important at the beginning of the process to understand how people are currently doing their work, and how they are currently sharing information and using information, so that you can make sure that you're implementing a system that fits with what they do, and rather than changing what they do to fit the system. Because if you force people to unnecessarily do things unnecessarily simply because that's how the system works, then that's going to cause a lot of resistance. You really want to make sure you understand what your current workflows are, and then evaluate the system against those, how things are being done now. Not to say you can't change how things are being done now, but it should be changed to make it more efficient and easier, not changed to add things because that's just how the system works, and staff just have to kind of live with it. So that's also really, really important. And to Harmony's question about, I have been doing this project through an election, and momentum is everything. Like once you've actually started, it's much easier to keep going than to try and start at that moment of change. So if you've actually got started and got some momentum, then that can help carry you through if there's a change in leadership, to sort of justify keeping going. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah. There's two things I would say there to Jennifer's points. One, that SharePoint example reminds me that 15 years ago I was working with the federal department and they were trying to do something similar, and it's never perfect, right? These applications are awfully designed for a smaller number of people. The vendor may be gone by the time you get there, and so, or even when it's like a big vendor like Microsoft who does SharePoint, they're designing for 1 billion people, and so it's hard to make a system that really fits perfectly. And so you may have to have this ongoing pruning of your garden where you're kind of, hey, people, are we doing our SharePoint thing? Do we need more training? Do we need to remind people of the why? And then to your point, Jennifer, about sitting with the people, we have a human-centered design practice at our firm. And what that is you sit with the people and you really understand what their day looks like. You're not in some back room designing some system away from what's important to them. You're really trying to understand, okay, what does Mary do when she gets to the office? Okay, where is her computer? How is she currently doing this? And by really understanding their day, you can really plan for success around it.
Yeah, that's so important. A lot of like clinical and health kind of projects have totally gone off the rails because people don't actually know how the clinicians do their job, right? Mm-hmm. So we've been talking a lot about technology kind of projects, but like even just kind of simpler than that with any given kind of change project. Like I was trying to think through, well, what examples do I have from my past that worked well in terms of just bringing people along? So like at a local level, something that I had participated in, like it's many years ago now, was like we did family meetings. So like each family kind of gathered and we, did a lot of really open discussion, kind of just in their homes or wherever they were comfortable, related to kind of a fairly big initiative that the government was doing at the time. So that was useful in that context. And then in my work life, something we did at a certain point was we actually created a change group that was all of the admin assistants, because we found that actually they talk to everybody more often than even the leaders in the organization. So we made sure they had all the kind of basic staff communication, and they were kind of our boots on the ground change champions throughout the organization. So those were a couple things that came to mind to me where like those kind of processes were useful in advancing the change. Like, do you have a couple of examples that are just from your own experience that were successful?
Yeah, I've got two, and Katie probably has others as well. One is in startup technology where I've spent some time, they talk about a hair on fire problem. When you're trying to find someone to procure your tool, you don't want somebody who's got like an inconvenience. They've got a hair on fire. They need a fire extinguisher. And so you're trying to find who has that hair on fire problem. And maybe it's the director of finance who just really needs this information every month. So they want to make sure that the education department has a good system for tracking education payments, for example. And those people can really support your change. And administrative assistants are often ones who you need to be champions. So you need to understand what's their hair on fire problem. The second one is a individual who was leading self-government negotiations. And they went through the first round to try and get citizen ratification, and they failed to get the appropriate amount of participants, and then got through successfully the second time. And he said, you know what works? And I said, what? He said, everything. And it's like, you have to have teas, to your point of meeting with families, or you just kind of have to really make sure that you're doing the work to get the change to happen.
I think probably my best example, and I touched on it earlier, but it was just the coolest thing of seeing it actually happen. We were implementing, it was a pretty straightforward change. Like we were just introducing a new form. It wasn't groundbreaking, but there was one guy who was very against it, and he would stand at the water cooler and talk about how this is such a waste of time. Why are we doing this? Blah, blah, blah. So we took a day pretty much to sit down and talk to him of what's actually going on here? What's the issue? And actually took the time to listen to what his issues were. And he ended up at the end of it being the biggest change champion for what we were trying to do for this whole larger project. That we ended up going to him for everything, being do you mind talking positively about this to your teammates? it made such a difference. And so just having like that one person who maybe is known as a negative Nancy a little bit, and getting them to buy into what you're doing can make such a difference in terms of getting everyone to see like, oh, maybe this isn't as bad. Like if he's into it, like it can't be that bad.
Yeah, if somebody's resisting, there's probably a reason why, and bulldozing over them is probably not going to contribute to success. But exactly like Katie just described, sitting, hearing, listening, unpacking can make the difference between success and failure.